Welcome to the podcast Social Work Successes, which aims to shine a big spotlight on the brilliant work that social work professionals do with children and families every day, because this is just not celebrated enough. Practitioners will be sharing their stories, which will hopefully not only inspire others, but also provide some helpful learning in relation to factors that may have contributed to that success. You guys deserve far more recognition than this podcast can give, but thank you for listening and everything you do for the families you work with. Welcome, Tom. Thank you for coming on the podcast, Social Work Successes. I'm super grateful for you for giving up your time today for us to hear your success story. Before we get started on that, though, I guess it's helpful just to introduce yourself and maybe give a little bit of an explanation about your kind of current role in practice.
Hi Alice, it's great to be here with you. So my current role is I am a practice specialist at Think Ahead, which is a fast track social work training program, and we train student social workers working in adult social care with a focus on mental health.
You. So today then, the family that you have in mind, that you're going to talk to us about is actually a family that you worked with in a previous role. So do you want to say a little bit more about what you were doing when you worked with this specific family you're going to talk about?
So I was working as a senior social worker in a child protection team, and it was a specialist adolescent edge of care team. So that was working with families with an index child of age between 10 and 18 years old and their siblings, if there were any, and working intensively with the family. And my role within the team was to work with the parents twice a week for 6 months. And that was the length of our intervention. And we would bring in the young person to the work that I was carrying out with their parents when it felt most helpful to do so.
Okay. So, thinking about this family that you're going to talk about, what were the initial kind of risks, concerns, or struggles and difficulties that they were having?
So my anonymized family is mum Jane, who was in her early 30s, and her son Billy, who was around 11 years old at the time. So for Jane and Billy, there was a lot going on when I became involved and started working with them. Um, Jane and Billy had had children's services involvement for most of Billy's life on and off. But the current kind of main risks and concerns were related to lots of physical incidents and fights at home between Jane and Billy. Billy's behavior had become very destructive at home, and he was destroying lots of things in the house. And he was getting frequently excluded from school, and that was only increasing the tension at home between him and his mum as he was being at home more and more often. Jane had a very difficult kind of life herself, very briefly, just including she was kind of kicked out of home when she was 16. Um, she was kind of criminally exploited. She had a number of relationships that were very violent, and men had perpetrated violence towards her, and they were involved in crime. Yeah, so the family were already working with children's services, but once kind of mum started calling up the allocated social worker at the time every day, saying I can't have Billy at home anymore, this would become kind of such a regular occurrence that a referral was made to our team, and that was the point where our team became involved.
Okay, so you kind of took them in at a point of crisis or breaking point, it sounds like.
Yeah, it was essentially the remit of our team. Yeah.
Okay. And how open was mum to working with you at the beginning?
Well, at the beginning, you might say very open because I think she wanted a particular outcome, or I say that I think she thought she wanted a particular outcome because of how constantly negative and difficult things felt at home. So she wanted Billy to go into the care system.
Hmm.
And in that sense, I think her mind was, I need to now tell this new social worker, Tom, just how bad things are and how awful Billy is being at home. And that will kind of enable me to get kind of what I want. Um, However, I think it was more complicated than that, in that um, me going in as a worker, my intention, which I stated explicitly, was that the was my role and hope was that we could work towards home life improving, Billy and Jane's relationship getting better, in order that he could stay at home. So that I made that very clear, and she agreed to meet and to work with me. So it was a
Mm.
complicated start, and it kind of meant that I needed to do some trying to meet her where she was at, but also try and let her know that we wanted to kind of achieve this other goal. But it was a kind of, I think it was important for me not to have gone too quickly in with saying this is what we're going to do and how we're going to do it, because that I think would have only led her to be very closed off to any intervention.
Okay, so thinking about um the what part of that work would you consider to have been a success?
So I think we talk a lot in social work about relationship-based practice, and I think that was really key to setting the foundations of the intervention that we carried out together, Jane and I. Because when she opened the door, she just started talking at me, led me through to the living room where we sat and had our sessions, and she kind of didn't stop talking from the moment she opened the door to when we sat down. And that first session, I probably said about 5 words in the whole hour or so that I was there. And it was Jane telling me all of these different things that Billy had been doing, that had been so difficult for her. And I think I left feeling completely overwhelmed, feeling quite frustrated, feeling completely unhelpful. I hadn't done anything to build a relationship, to do any kind of thinking together. So I went back to my team, and I think I didn't even need to say anything. And then they saw me walk through the door to the office and saw that I was quite fraught and overwhelmed. And so I sat down with one of the members of my team, and they just asked me to kind of give them a bit of a summary of what had happened, which enabled me to reflect on what had gone on, not just kind of practically, but also relationally and emotionally. So I realized that I hadn't contained any of the kind of thoughts or feelings that Jane was sharing with me, nor had I brought any purpose or structure to the sessions. I hadn't enabled us to actually agree what shall we have a think and a talk about today. And I reflected on my own feelings of frustration, of feeling quite upset about some of the things that Jane was sharing with me, and I think that made it harder for me kind of to have the courage to respectfully interrupt her and kind of bring us kind of on track in some way. So kind of I used my team to help me think this through a bit. When I went back the next time, kind of a similar thing happened. And it was a case of me trying to do a bit more of that respectful interrupting. And over the next kind of 2 or 3 visits, I just did it more explicitly and a bit more assertively at the start. And what I mean by that is I just tried to really interrupt her quite early on and say, Jane, please just is it all right if you tell me a bit about how you're feeling right now in this moment? And it was quite an interesting moment because she then was silent for quite a long time, and it was really difficult for her to kind of reflect on and think about how she was feeling. And what she ended up saying was that she's just always in this kind of fast mode. Her head's always in this really fast space. And essentially, what we then explored what that looked like and meant for her. And she talked about her mind just having so many fast thoughts all of the time, all of them really negative in relation to Billy, but also herself. Um, and that she was just constantly exhausted. But she didn't really realize this until we slowed down and had a discussion about it. And from that, I then asked her if there were any other modes. We kind of called it the mode or the fast lane, I think it was, that she got into. And the other main lane, as she named it, was the slow lane. So she had these kind of two extremes that she was in a lot of the time, which was either the fast lane or the slow lane. And the slow lane represented when she felt really depressed, which had kind of happened a lot on and off over her life. And obviously, with things being so difficult now, she did feel depressed quite a lot about how things were happening in her life for her and her family. But I think it was what she said was it was easier to be in the fast lane than to sit with those really difficult feelings in the slow lane, those feelings of guilt and shame. So she tended to be in the fast lane more, but at certain points that would just become too much and she would deflate and be in the slow lane. But in both of those lanes, it was very hard for her to really pause and think and relax. And it was very hard for her to be the best parent she could be as well. And I think whilst these were difficult conversations for her to have, I think the interest that I took in her and and what was going on in her mind and her feelings kind of really enabled her to kind of start to trust me a bit because I was really interested in her. I wasn't just interested in what was going on for her son, even though they're obviously related. And then we kind of came up with this third lane, which was the medium lane or the middle lane, and that she was able to get herself into the middle lane from time to time. And there were times when things were going better between her and Billy, and for her in general, but they were very much kind of few and far between. But that also enabled me to give her the experience of telling someone about when she was doing well as a mum and when Billy was doing better, going in and staying in school for longer periods of time. And that was, I guess, start of the relationship building process. But what was interesting about that process of the first month or two was the start of every session after the third or fourth session, I kind of laid this foundation of asking her how she was feeling today and naming the lane that she was in. And after her kind of avoiding it at the start and wanting to still just rant and get things off her chest,
Mm.
she started to kind of be more prepared for me. Like in a bit of a jokey way, she would say she knew that she was going to ask me about which lane she was in. And then over the course of the next few sessions, because we had written this down, we had done it on paper, she had actually got the three pieces of paper, fast, medium, and slow, laying out on the floor for my arrival. And I guess this indicated to me that she was really starting to reflect on her own feelings, her own state of mind, how she was doing on a daily basis. That she was doing it mainly in relation to kind of the sessions and the purpose of the work we were going to do together. But then what
And
we
do
did
you
after
think,
that was to then take that to other aspects of her life, and namely, obviously, her relationship with Billy.
yeah, and do you think for her this was the first time somebody was curious to hear and understand her feelings?
I think so. I think obviously as social workers we are faced with a lot of risk and we become involved in families' lives when there are crises and really difficult things happening and often we can get really drawn to those behaviors related to the risk and the worry. And I think what my team really helped me to do was to think about, okay, what is it that's driving those behaviors, both in mum and in Billy?
Mm.
And it was what I think helped me to keep going into those sessions with that curiosity and with that curiosity directed towards mum, because that was something that I knew if I don't do that, if I start asking her, how do you think Billy's thinking and feeling about this, it would possibly or probably invoke feelings of defensiveness, because that might unintentionally make her feel a bit blamed, for what's going on in Billy's life. Um, so it was really part of a kind of a curious, non-judgmental approach. But it was about me kind of being open to accessing that help from my team because, as I said before, there was a lot going on in those sessions, and Jane was, she was talking about lots of really difficult things that had happened in Billy's life, but also in her life over the course of our conversations.
Yeah.
So
I
yeah,
was gonna
starting to really, sorry, go on.
Yeah, sorry, no, I was just going to add that I think at the beginning that sounded like a really important piece of why this was a success because you could step away and you had that time and resource and support around you to just have a bit of reflection on yourself and what had come up for you and how you were feeling. And it sounded at the beginning like there was that a bit of the projection of the sense of helplessness and hopelessness that mum had brought to you that you'd then walked away with. And having somewhere to kind of process that yourself sounds like that was a really fundamental part of this being the success that it was.
Yes, and I think what had happened in kind of previous social work interventions was that the workers were kind of trying their best and kind of saying to mum, we can't just take your son into care because that was what she was calling up and saying,
Mm.
and demanding essentially. And I think it was that response which was trying to kind of pause that thought in mum and initiate another conversation, I think, because it was kind of met so directly. I think that's where it was difficult for maybe other work to take place. Um, and I think that approach of really trying to get on board and on side with mum, with Jane, was something that was very much kind of my focus and my priority at the start.
Which I think I've had lots of conversations this week with various practitioners about this idea of um, can you be parent focused and child focused? If you're too parent focused, does that mean you're not child focused? But essentially, if you're not parent focused, you can't really be child focused because it's going to be down to the parent, isn't it, to make any of these changes or to access the support that you're providing. And so if you don't do this bit, nothing is going to change for that child. And so sometimes I think that's just a really important thing to bring into our focus at the start of that um, piece of work. Um, okay, so
Similarly,
yeah.
sorry, Alice. I was just going to say in relation to that, I used to think, well, I do think about it quite a lot as, we're trying to support parents to attune to their children's needs, and kind of what's going on for their children emotionally, as well as physically and everything else. And it's like if we're kind of supporting and wanting parents to be able to do that tuning to their parents, to their children's needs and minds, as social workers, we need to be doing the attuning to what's going on in their mind. And it's almost like a bit of a domino effect or a Russian doll if you can't expect one person to do it unless we're doing it for them as well.
And it
And I guess the
sounds
reason I
like, oh, sorry. I was gonna say it sounds like here, this is what happened with this mum. You created your little system with your lanes, which totally got mum into a place of mentalizing for herself. So she could be a lot more conscious of where she was. And I guess did you then see a knock-on effect of once she could start mentalizing for herself, she was able to then think about things from her child's perspective, maybe differently?
Yeah, absolutely. I think once we had kind of built that trust, that epistemic trust of her kind of feeling really, having had enough experiences of me really, really concertedly trying to understand her experiences, what it's like to be her, in those really difficult experiences, we started to have conversations about some of the physical incidents and the fights that were going on at home. And she was able to start to see how some of the things that she did or said to Billy could provoke him into then kind of an angry or aggressive response. And we had one really interesting session where we looked at we were looking at when arguments didn't turn into kind of physical fights and essentially Jane hitting Billy. and when they did, and kind of what was going on, that led down those two different paths. And kind of at the start, there was a clear difference of how stressed Jane was at the very beginning of the argument. So thinking about her own day, her own life, the things that she's got going on. Um, and it was obviously it was more likely that she would get too stressed, um, and maybe react physically to Billy during an argument. If when that was the starting point, she could identify that when she was if she was in a calmer, kind of happier state of mind, even if Billy said something that might provoke her, she was more able to deflect or distract or use humor. Um, she was hilarious. So her ability to use humor when she could was really powerful. But the other really interesting thing came from this session was that when Billy swore at Jane, Jane realized from this conversation that, um, when Billy swore at her, Billy's dad would pop into her mind, and she'd think Billy would never swear at his dad, or about his dad. Why can he swear at me when I'm the one who's bringing him up? And that was such a strong kind of physical set brought such a strong physical sensation in her that was a really big contributing factor to her then getting physically angry with Billy, and then when she would end up hitting him. And she had never really realized that before, I guess, because she hadn't been able to kind of think it through in a kind of a clear headspace,
Yeah.
and really kind of naming that and noticing that, and me not kind of judging her or doing one of those terrible things in social work that we do, which is getting her to write a written agreement never to hit him again. This was kind of the risk assessment, and it was risk assessing, but also it was really an actively supportive intervention in just helping her to realize that and notice that. Because the other really significant thing that came from it, which was after she hit Billy, she went into these huge, really deep feelings of guilt and shame. She would then buy him loads of sweets and treats, but without really saying why. And she might even kind of tell him that he didn't need to go into school the next day. And so there was no real repair done between the two of them. And it was very difficult for Jane to make any more sense of it for herself.
And also I
So I
imagine
think,
quite hard for Billy to also make sense of
yeah,
when there's no kind of, well, I guess a lot of the unpredictability around it, but to experience that kind of uh more punitive behavior in amongst kind of the reward, but it all being muddled in together. And it sounds to me like you were able to get her to a place where she could take a step back from what she was doing in the immediate and really be able to make those links herself and reflect herself, which is so much more powerful, isn't it, than you just simply telling her, well, this is why you're doing this and this is what you need to do differently. So, what would you say were the biggest challenges in your relationship with Jane?
I think some of the challenges were me kind of knowing how much or not to talk about Billy's father, as even though he hadn't been a part of Billy's life, he's obviously a significant person for Billy. I think, a contributing factor to some of the difficulties in Billy and Jane's relationship was Jane not really knowing how to respond to Billy when Billy asked questions about his father, that becoming a very frustrating thing for Jane. And I think I it was hard for me to know in the time that we had kind of how much to talk about that or not in a way that helped Jane to feel kind of really validated and understood about it, whilst not opening up kind of a piece of work that, we might not be able to get to as a kind of a helpful resolution,
Mm.
of how Jane could kind of think about this and think about this with Billy, um, which I think I tried to name, but and thinking about my own obviously position coming into the family system and thinking about me being male, um, it was something that I think was maybe not was a challenge in me knowing how much to say and not to say. Um, and maybe Jane also not knowing how much to really talk about it. So it wasn't a challenge in the sense of a kind of a barrier, but more, I think it was almost it was a bit of something that was left a bit unsaid in our working relationship.
Okay. And what do you think, okay, what three things do you think contributed to getting a successful outcome with this work that you did with them?
I think a lot of it was kind of down to that early work that I've been talking about in terms of the helping Jane to understand and kind of notice and reflect on her own, I guess, states of mind, and her becoming much more aware of those as a starting point for her to be more able to then think about and reflect on what were some of the things that were driving some of Billy's behaviors. Not only things that were going on in the moment, but things that might have been there from his whole childhood, including past violence that he witnessed, his lack of contact um, with his father, potential feelings of abandonment and rejection from that. So I think that was a really important one. I think another thing we did was we explored play quite a bit in our intervention, and the reason for that was because of I guess the lack of fun that Billy and Jane had been having for quite a long time. So we explored the purpose and meaning of play together, Jane and I. And whilst she kind of said that, the purpose of play is for the child to have fun, well, we talked about that. We kind of had a session on talking about play. And then we followed up the next session by having a play session, myself, Jane, and Billy. Unfortunately, it didn't go very well. And although Jane had kind of said that she had, understood the purpose of play to be to help for the child to have fun, it became quite apparent in the session, and then from follow-up sessions when we talked about the game that we played. We played a card game, and we were trying to set up for it to be really fun, but ultimately for Billy to win the game. And we did. We managed that. But when Billy did a bit of a ha ha, I've won to his mum, Jane just the pack of cards that she had in her hand, she threw them into Billy's face, which obviously was quite a difficult incident to have been there to witness. And but again, it was kind of going back to my team that there hadn't been injury caused or physical injury, but obviously it was a very difficult experience for Billy to have. I think it was also quite representative of a lot of the arguments that they were having.
And I guess mum's reaction and response in there is just there's so much below surface level, isn't there? Something about that, the way that he was maybe like wanting to assert that he was better than her, or was the winner and she was the loser, and just all of the feelings that perhaps maybe came up linked to her own trauma history is what has gone on to kind of cause that level of reaction.
Yeah, absolutely. So in those kind of follow-up sessions, we looked back to those fast, medium, and slow lane cards, and we reflected, and Jane reflected that while she had been in the medium lane at the start of the game, some of Billy's behaviour during the game had, as you said, kind of provoked her into and like triggered some of her mind to go into other places that will have been linked to some of her own past relational and developmental experiences. But her ability to do that was amazing. And I guess not to cut too much more out, but just to show how far we came and how and what Jane did was at the end of the intervention, we went to a bowling alley, myself, Jane, and Billy, with the exact same intention of letting Billy win and being able to enjoy the moment. And I have to get careful not to get too emotional about this because it was such an amazing experience and a privilege to be part of. But Jane, we did enable Billy to win the bowling game, He was
It
absolutely
can't be
obsessed with.
easy, right? Purposefully, I mean, bowling is just, I mean, you can't really plan where your ball's going anyway. But like trying to make sure that it does. If I tried to make sure I didn't score, I'd probably end up like, getting a strike or whatever it is. But yes, so carry on.
Yes, but and without Billy realizing that that's what we were doing, but we managed it, and Billy, who was a huge wrestling fan, and in particular a wrestler called Roman Reigns, who I learned a lot about during those 6 months. So Billy, he won the bowling, and he basically ran around the bowling alley doing his best Roman Reigns impression. Not only did Jane kind of just let him do that, but she literally like ran around with him, copying his Roman Reigns impression. And it was just incredible to see how much joy they both got from that experience. And it completely usurped the joy that Billy had of winning the game. Just having his mum just make him feel even better and happier. And
And
it was
that
kind of those.
shared joy, right? The fact that they're
Mm,
both then like it's not just Billy, but mum is able to get joy from seeing him be in a place of joy. And then he's got more joy because he's seeing mum being happy. And the two things are just, it's like so brilliant when you can have moments of that when there has been so much rupture. You know, that is like really solid repair within that relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess the third positive thing that we did in the work was with school essentially. So with permission of Jane and kind of we took things from some of the activities that we did together, like Billy's timeline. Um, we kind of did it in a way that then with Billy that felt okay for both Jane and Billy, and said, how about we share this with the safeguarding lead at your school so that they can understand a little bit about what's been going on for you that's meant that school has sometimes felt really hard. So we went in and did that together, and really helped. And the school were very open to it, the safeguarding lead. But she also kind of, we spoke afterwards, and she kind of talked about how they just hadn't really thought about this at all, even though they had obviously known the family had been known to children's services on and off for a long time. But we helped the school to understand Billy a lot more and what was still going on for them. They increased and adapted the support they were offering to Billy as a result of that. And this was all going on at a time when Billy was about to transition to high school, which, change can be really difficult when there's lots and lots going on. But we don't always get this privilege. But I went into his high school, I remember, a few months after he had started and a few months after I had finished working with the family. And I saw Billy. I was going in to see another child, but I saw Billy walking to a lesson, and he came over and talked to me, and he spoke really proudly about how well he had been doing in his new school, about the friends that he had been making, and the fact that he had been in pretty much every day, and that was a few months in. And obviously, as that work kind of transitioning, helping his new school to understand some of the things that have been going on for him, and some of the things that are more helpful for him, from people in authority, and the school again really took that on board. And it was about Jane's relationship with both schools, because there had been battlegrounds at times, but it was really, social workers only have the time to do so much. So kind of focusing time on repairing those relationships between Jane and key person in school enabled that work to happen without me, more and more regularly as we got towards the end of our intervention.
Brilliant. Okay, so just sum up those three things. Number one is creating this system which enabled Jane to be able to start mentalizing for herself, which then opened up her capacity to start to be able to see things a little bit more from Billy's perspective. Number two was creating those moments between them of shared joy. Number three was doing that work with the school. So incorporating them more, I guess, again, by probably getting them to see things from this more mentalized perspective, talking about Billy's feelings, but obviously, of course, mum's as well, and how that was in the mix and contributing to some of those behaviors. Okay, so lastly, what do you love most about your job?
It's as a social worker, you just get to meet and work with the most amazing people. And I think sometimes it's when you work with people who don't realize how great they are and how amazing they are. I'm talking about the children and families that we work with because they've got so much going on and because they've been through so much themselves, kind of relational developmental trauma, oppression, marginalization, racism, all of these kind of everything from kind of individual and familial difficulties to wider systemic influences that really impact on people's lives. All the way up to kind of politically, people have been through so much and have so little. It's just an absolute privilege to learn from them as well as about them, and you learn so much from them, and they give you amazing perspectives on life. And yeah, I really miss them. I really miss the families that I work with now that I'm in my kind of role that's a few steps back. But I think it's a very humbling job, but it's one where you can really appreciate the amazing qualities that people have and how they get through such difficult times. And just it's amazing to think how some of them did let me through the door when they had so much going on sometimes. And as social workers, we can be seen as representatives of the state, and often, we're misunderstood in that we just go in obviously to take children away. That's not what social workers are there to do unless absolutely necessary. And it's a feeling of privilege of being able to work on an equal level with people, and that takes a lot of courage from them, I think. So it's about just how much I've learned about myself, as well about being human and humane. Yeah, it's incredibly fulfilling.
That's probably one of the longer answers to the question that I've
Oh,
had,
really?
but no, it was lovely. It was great. It's absolutely lovely to hear, to speak with such passion that is clearly still there, for you and doing this work. And I agree absolutely with that sense of privilege. Obviously, it comes with a lot of other challenges alongside it. But I think having that at the core, that passion still there somewhere, kind of mitigates that as well at times. So brilliant. Okay, thank you very much, Tom, for sharing your success story. Thank you for listening. This podcast is really in its infancy phase, so please do like, share, subscribe, tell your colleagues, tell your managers, tell anyone else that you think might benefit. Thank you.